Welcome to the webinar on enterprise-grade AI guardrails for your content standards. So I'm Shane Cumming. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at Acrolinx, and I'm joined today by Kurt Raffi, our Chief Product Officer, and Sean Angus, who is our Head of Solution Consulting. So how are you doing, guys?
We are good today, Shane. Got a great day. We're in the Boston area. Things are exciting.
We've got a great topic here, so are you ready to dive in?
Please.
Let's go.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so here is some recent news, right? Just in the last 60 days that you may have seen. So let's take a tour through what has hit the airwaves. So first, Mr. Sam Altman coming at you with just a ton of likes. Like ChatGPT is like mildly embarrassing at best. GPT-4 is the dumbest model any of you are ever going to have to use. So, the mission that OpenAI is on is to bring artificial general intelligence to the world. And so Sam Altman has a view on that mission and probably a lot of information about the advancement of this technology. And he clearly thinks it's going to take leaps and bounds, right, from where we are today. So there was that. Followed a little bit later in May by this post that went absolutely viral on LinkedIn. And what this post was really about by Vital Balwit, who's the chief of staff to the Anthropic CEO. What it was about is she believes that AGI, artificial general intelligence, is going to be here in the short term. So much so that many jobs are going to be eliminated very soon, and these are the last 5 years that she will be working. And what's interesting about this is, the brightest minds in the industry vary wildly on the time, right? Some think it's in the short term, couple years, some think it's 20 plus years out, but the point is it's on the horizon, and when it comes, it's going to be very disruptive to many jobs. When machines become equal or better at doing work, which is what AGI is, then there's going to be displacement. So anxiety, followed a little bit later in May by OpenAI. So they officially told us they began training their next frontier model. We think it's GPT-5, although we thought they were already training that before. So maybe it's GPT-6, we don't really know. So that's happening. And some of you may have caught this piece of news as well from Microsoft. So Microsoft launched a new feature that was taking thousands of screenshots of your PC as part of the capability that they're going to deliver. There's a big backlash from some customers who were concerned about that, and so they needed to address that. Not to be outdone by Elon Musk, who is going to ban Apple products in his organizations if OpenAI is integrated at an operating system level, which it sounds like it's going to be. And then a little bit later, Adobe was dealing with some blowback as well on some kind of policy language they had that made it sound like they were going to train on your data, and then they said they weren't. So, I mean, this space will make your head spin.
Glad you picked a space that wasn't too controversial as well, Shane. That's awesome.
Yeah, lots of controversy. Things are moving so fast, right? And one of our objectives here today is to simplify the landscape and to help shine a light on what are some of the important trends and information that you need to be aware of if you're a large enterprise figuring out your strategy in this space. So that's what we aim to do today. So the agenda we have lined up here is we're going to cover some trends in enterprise deployments of generative AI. We're then going to specifically look at AI guardrails for content standards and what are we seeing in the real world, right? We're fortunate to work with many of the largest companies in the world, and we'd like to share some of what we're seeing. And then throughout the session today, we're going to talk about some important terminology. And there's also an AI glossary that was shared with you leading up to this event, and we'll share it again at the end as well. So that's what we'll cover. So let's jump into it. There is a voracious appetite for content. This was a paper that was published by IBM, Adobe and AWS recently in March this year. And in this paper, 88% of respondents reported that the demand for content has doubled in the past 2 years, right? Doubled. But what was even more than that is that looking ahead, 2/3 are predicting that the demand for content is going to increase 5 to 20 times in the next 2 years, right? So we're in a world where the demand for content is absolutely exploding at the same time that the ability to create content is growing exponentially. And I don't know, Kurt, is this what you're seeing as well and from your vantage point?
Yeah, and I'm old enough to remember, Shane, the concept of there is no bad content. Well, we're now getting hit with this tsunami of content. So there very well might be some bad content in that batch, but yeah, I mean, you think about all the industries that are being kind of affected by this, and I think that the net is we've simplified content creation and accelerated the ability to create content beyond where people thought was possible. I worked on apps a few years ago and was creating small business content, and I think I shared with you guys, I had to create 3,000 or 4,000 pieces of small business content to guide them in how to run their businesses. And I hired writers around the world and kind of gamification experts. And it took us 1.5 years to do that. And I could probably do that in a day or two today. So yeah, the appetite is amazing, and the ability to produce it is on steroids.
It's, I mean, this is new territory that we found ourselves in very, very quickly, right? Just in the past couple of years, it's amazing.
And Sean doesn't create bad content. Sean only creates good content. So, Sean, I know that you have a different lens on all of this, but
no, not true, right? You still need the human factor in the content creation process in order to validate the quality and the alignment of the audience, right? So this technology will get better. It's not there yet, right? So this notion of having guardrails around how you create content, where you create content, where that content is being ingested, right, is more important. If I play on the numbers on the screen, it becomes 5 to 20 times more important.
Yeah. New world. So all of this growth, right? Growth in demand, growth in creation, it's really bringing in some new ways of thinking about how we get our arms around this as large enterprises. And that leads us to the first trend that we would like to touch on, which is the idea that in this new world, we need to think about content in terms of a supply chain. So this is an excellent paper that was published, again, same report we just went through, but there have been other reports that have been published recently by Deloitte Digital and others. And so organizations are really starting to think about content in terms of a supply chain, just like if you're creating cars or creating equipment, right, that in order to be able to scale, you need to think about it in some new and different ways. And so, you know, when we think about a supply chain in terms of content, we think about what the steps are, and generative AI has an important role in that supply chain to really amplify it. And, you know, in this report, you know, there were some basically 3 really important takeaways. So the first one is that it is time now to think about new ways to create and manage content, right? Content supply chain thinking. Number 2 was that AI can take content production to an entirely new level, right? Entirely new level. But the third point was really interesting, is that to get there are some missing links, right? And the 2 main missing links are best practices and governance, right? Best practices and governance. And so that's, you know, and that's what we're starting to see as well across our customers.
Yeah, I love the manufacturing analogy too that sort of plays into this, guys. When you think about manufacturing on a small scale, or let's say Etsy, handcrafted goods, or even when cars, although I wasn't there, I read about it, when cars were first introduced, they were much more handcrafted. And then you had Henry Ford suddenly opening the fire hose for how cars are made, pricing them accordingly, and pushing them out the door faster than anyone thought. Well, the tires, the headlights, the paint all had to be there at the right time. And that analogy works pretty well with the idea of generative AI. It's a fire hose of content creation. So how do you plan when it arrives? How do you approve it? And Sean would say, Kurt, no, that's not good. This is good. No, that's not good. And then the whole concept of content as data, how it's engaged with, how popular is it, how powerful, does it have authority, how is it tagged? How do you kind of arrange all of that and store it in appropriate repositories and use it when necessary? And how do you update it if it gets out of date? All of that stuff. And then how do you continually measure the validity and the power of that content going forward? It's a new world, but I think that it's funny, until this term, the content supply chain, was created, I don't think we have as good a framework, but it's really helpful to apply that manufacturing analogy.
Well, one of the shifts is people have traditionally thought about who is my audience, who are the users, right? Who's consuming the content, right? That list stays the same, but that list gets longer because we now have to think about machines consuming the content, right? So that notion of tagging, storing, is it approved content? Does it contain the knowledge and information that it needs to and must for machines to consume it? Right, that's important to operationalize accessing the content in all these new ways.
Yeah, it's not just clickbait for humans. It is potentially machines testing. Yeah.
Yeah, we write for a new audience, right? We write for people and we write for machines these days. Yep. And interesting, some of the most foremost thought leaders that we work with, we're actually starting to see content supply chain as a named part of an organization structure, right? So this is really starting to get some traction across the industry.
They're also starting to shift in the organization into a business analytics space within the company, right? The content really is a product, right? But it's what insight do you have into it that is driving a lot of the decision making around the AI and LLM strategies that are forming.
That is content becoming data almost within that
100%
analytics team.
Yep.
So let's make the connection to AI guardrails. If you are like many Acrolinx customers, you work in a large organization, large enterprise. Here's the thing. You probably have some type of style guide. It's typically at least a dozen pages, very often hundreds of pages long. And you need to ask yourself a basic question, right? Do our standards matter, right? Do the standards reflected in our style guide, our terminology sets, our rules, do they matter or don't they, right? Does it matter that as content production is increasing exponentially, that it's inclusive? Does it matter that it meets your local regulatory requirements, which can be different by geography? In a large global organization, there's a lot of complexity there. Does it matter that the tone is right? You typically write for very different audiences. Is the tone right for someone who is frustrated? They have a product issue, they're trying to access your support and they're trying to get clear answers, as opposed to some other types of technical documentation, or perhaps it's customer communication letters or marketing, whatever the use case. If you write for patients and practitioners, right, is the reading level the correct and appropriate for those different audiences, right? And if it doesn't matter that your content is clear, that it's consistent, that it's devoid of errors that cause problems. If it does matter in a world where production is increasing dramatically, then you need to have some type of guardrails. You need to have AI guardrails to protect your content standards in that environment. And if you think about it, in terms of supply chain, if you're heading on this journey, like many companies are, to build a content supply chain, you need a QA layer. If you make cars, you make equipment, you need a QA layer. And if you think about content as a supply chain, you need to have a QA layer.
Shane, the other thing I'd call out is a lot of people think of style, as brand or tone, but I think you've unpacked, it goes way beyond that, is compliance. You can't use these words. You can only refer to products in a certain way. So those guardrails, as you think beyond just brand, and are you a casual tone of voice or a formal tone of voice, it goes way beyond there, doesn't it?
Way beyond, because when standards are not followed, what happens is business risk is created, right? There's many different types of business risk. Compliance risk, there is brand degradation. There are many different types of violations. And if you think about it and read the research, I mean, the main way that we communicate with our customers today, it's not through a human, it's through content, right? This is the character of who you are. This is the experience that you provide. And again, it's an important question. Does it matter?
We had a global customer have their website shut down in China because of claims-based language on the site. And the Chinese government said, no, you're not using that language to communicate to their citizens, right? So they just shut the site down, right? That's a decent chunk of their business that takes place in China, and you can't have that, right? So how do you find that how do you have that problem not occur in the first place, right? You got to think about that. And then how do you triage that if it were to happen? And the guardrails that we're going to talk about in kind of the real world examples will highlight some of the concepts that you can bring into your organization if you're not already applying them today.
As you guys talk, the common underlying theme is risk to me that I hear. And I mean, if that circuitous dotted line is a guardrail, by the way, it looks like a dangerous road to be driving on to begin with. The risk is you drive off the road without the guardrails. And so everyone's concerned that AI is going to do the wrong thing. So how do we make it do the right thing? And I think that's kind of the net to address the risk.
Yeah. All right, so as you think about your own standards and how much they matter, let's take a look at some other data points and some of the trends in the industry that need to be taken into consideration when thinking about putting guardrails in place. Okay, so this was another excellent report by A16Z Partners, published in March this year as well. And what's clear in this report is that the dominant model in use by enterprises today is OpenAI, right? In use meaning in production. And interestingly, almost 80% of the enterprises that use OpenAI are coming through the Microsoft Azure partnership. If you take a look at the chart on the right, this tells some pretty interesting, provides some pretty interesting information. If I could draw your attention to the teal colors, those represent how many organizations surveyed are testing different types of models. And you can see that there's a significant number of models that are in testing at the moment. And that's important because the models that organizations are testing are likely, right, to be the models that move into production later, right? And organizations are likely to use multiple different types of models, but that's an early indicator that we're going to see a proliferation, of different types of models used by large enterprises.
Easy for you to say, right?
Hey, I'm trying. So we're going to see a lot of different models in use. The other thing that's really interesting when you look across this, at the very bottom of this chart, you'll see which models are closed versus open. And, it's clear that there's a lot of testing going on of open models, right? And so, what's going on with open source models? What's happening here that we might see more of? So it seems that open source is booming. And in this report, they also provided some information on, how, why that's happening. And, if you take if I can draw your attention to the blue part of this chart on the left, you can see that 41% of the respondents reported that they will increase or already use a majority open source models. And if you look to the red though, an additional 41% reported that they're going to switch to open source when the performance matches. Okay, so what this report was predicting is that we're going to see a shift, which is today about 80% closed source, 20% open source in production, to more of a 50-50 split, right, through 2024 and into 25 and beyond. Okay, so this is a trend that is happening. So it's pretty interesting. So the other piece of information I found was really interesting is why, right? So why is this happening? And so they asked that question. What are the and if you take a look to the right around the primary reasons, so why do enterprises care about open source? It's really two main reasons: control and customization. Okay, what does control mean? Control means it's really two things. One is that enterprises that have data that is very sensitive, they want to be absolutely certain that it's secure. Right? And if you use an open source model in your own infrastructure, it gives you a greater level of security. So that's one important part of control. The other part of control is they really want to understand why these models are producing the outputs that they are. Right? They want to have control over that. On the customization level, as enterprises deploy different models for specific use cases, they want to be able to fine tune those models, right? That's what this report said. So control and customization were the main reasons. What is not a main reason or primary reason cited was cost, right? Deploying open source is expected to be less expensive, but that's not a primary reason. And so as one, if they deploy closed source, it's more expensive. They're not deploying open source to save money. So as one executive said, getting an accurate answer is worth the money, right? That's what's driving this. And so, I mentioned fine tuning, Kurt, I've heard about grounding. I've heard about this thing called RAG. Could you clarify? That sounds like important terminology that we should know about. Can you clarify a bit of what those terms mean?
Happy to expound on some stuff, but I think once again, as you go to the next slide, the whole idea here is around control and risk. How do we limit that? How do I get that right answer is what that CEO is willing to pay for. So there are a couple of approaches of getting to the right answer. And I don't mean to be academic here for the group, but remember, a large language model has a lot of data, a lot of content fed into it to train it. And using neural networks and the algorithms, it begins to learn from going through all of that information. Well, what if you want to train or ground your LLM for very specific use cases? What if you wanted, if you trained on a very wide data set, but you want to train your LLM to do something very specific? Well, you probably want to train it on a narrower data set. Maybe it's for very specific customer service applications or for code creation. I don't know. Maybe very specific medical applications. So you want to kind of bring that data set that you add to your training of the LLM so it knows how to respond with a narrower data set. And then there's this other very tongue twister. I was teasing Shane about a tongue twister about proliferation. I can't say that, Shane, after one glass of Chardonnay, but retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, is another tongue twister or mouthful that is, in essence, once you've trained an LLM, you have your LLM reach out to an authoritative data source. It produces an output, and the data source says, is that right, wrong, or indifferent? And sometimes when you think about how LLMs are trained, it may be trained on older data or 2 years ago data. If you want the most current, up-to-date, or accurate information, maybe retrieval augmented generation, that RAG data source, providing the ultimate source of truth to say, no, you really didn't mean to say that, LLM, you meant to say this. That can help. So as you see from the percentages down at the bottom right, 72% of the folks now are kind of leaning into fine tuning. RAG is also very popular and it's increasing in value, but neither of these have to be independent of the other. That plus symbol in the middle says you could do both. You could fine tune around a narrower data set for specific purposes, but if you wanted to reach out, maybe let's go back to that example for medical purposes. You're training it to answer certain things, but medical research has to be kept up to date, right? So reach out to the authoritative repository of information that's very current, and maybe that updates and helps the output of your LLM. But ultimately, once again, it's how do you provide guardrails around that output and make sure it's appropriate. Once again, I don't mean to be academic, but the whole risk of LLMs is they'll start thinking a little crazy and they'll hallucinate is the term that's used out there. And that's ultimately a way of saying just a bad answer. So we don't want that. And as this tsunami of generative content comes out, how do we either fine tune, RAG, enrich our outputs, or apply both to help bring together a better output from these large language models?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, and that really brings us to, okay, so what are companies actually doing, right? How are they implementing different approaches to grounding in reality, specifically related to their content standards? So I would like to start to move to this section, but before we jump into it, Sean's going to take us through this, but before we jump into this, we'd like to run a quick poll. So let me fire this poll up.
Shane's very good at multitasking. Oh, there we go.
There we go. There we go. So is the content you're responsible for used to fine tune your company's LLMs today? And
so assuming that a lot of folks in the audience here are responsible for producing content, and do they use that to fine tune the large language model for their company?
Yeah, and I think as you shared, Kurt, that fine tuning is the kind of dominant approach today for grounding, and that would also apply to standards. So, all right, we have the responses coming in here. So let me just 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll close this and share the results. All right.
You know what? I love the honesty of not a clue. That's great. Isn't that true, guys? You see that everyone says they know everything about large language models or AI, but it's oftentimes a black box to a lot of folks.
It really is, and I think we're all on a journey here, folks, and we're at different stages in the different organizations that we work on, and yeah, again, appreciate the honesty on that. 40% said yes, 31% said no, 29% not really sure. So, Sean, with that,
Sure.
Let me hand things over to you and tell us what's really going on out there in the real world.
Sure. So people are fine tuning and they are using RAG. We can dive into some examples here that we've built out. If you proceed for me, Shane. The idea of guardrails and the idea of grounding, right? How do you do that? And there's some simple concepts of know the content that you're putting into the large language model, right? Know it before it goes in, right? Have the ability to see and analyze and score and measure, right? The old adage of if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, right? It's timeless. right? And it very much applies here in this context, right? So know what you're dealing with before it goes into a fine-tuning process, right? That fine-tuning process, it's expensive, right? So being able to automate that process as much as possible is certainly a business goal that makes sense, right? We've got solutions and approaches for how we can do that, right? You can do it with repository integrations. You can do it with bulk checking and analysis. So that is one thought, is before the content goes into these LLMs, right, know what it is. Then the other side of that is, if you proceed, right, the content that is being generated, right? How do you understand and get visibility into the quality of what is being generated? It's another consideration. And again, those same concepts of analyzing, checking at scale, right? These form the foundations on either side of the LLM. That's the foundation where you need to apply the guardrails to ensure that you can operationalize generative AI and put it in the hands of the people who need it or who are already using it, right? And have it be safe. So another concept to layer in, or another value, is the idea of integrating into your editorial process and your workflow. That's part of that content supply chain, right? Is the logical places where you can complement your human resources with technology in order to give you visibility. And again, so simple things like quality gates, right? If I'm going from a drafting to editing to approving, right? Where in that business flow does it make sense to have a filter or a check on what is moving through the organization? And then the last item here is, it kind of goes back to that story about the global customer that had their website checked out, right? We all have lots of content that is already out in the world doing its job, right? There is risk there if we're not already governing what is there. So being able to analyze, get visibility into that from an audit perspective, risk mitigation perspective, it's just another best practice. It's part of this this guardrail notion. If we roll forward, we can take a look at some real examples. So this is a fine-tuning example, but the context for it is this organization recognized that they have a large repository of knowledge in a knowledge base. It's made up of articles. Articles are made up of problems and resolutions, or questions and answers. Those align directly with the idea of a prompt and a completion, right? I'm going to ask a question. I want to get an answer. Right? This becomes the foundation of fine-tuning, which is you curate a set of content, prompts and completions, and then you submit that into the LLMs in this fine-tuning process. Right? So support articles are just a natural fit, where in this case, what they're trying to generate out of the LLM is a conversational chatbot experience. Right, so the writers and editors, they're not writing from scratch. They're leveraging the intellectual property that already exists. They're curating that content in order to ensure and improve the LLM's ability to generate that conversational experience that they're looking for their customers to have with them. Right, and then across this whole landscape, Acrolinx can help. Right, so the idea of kind of a workflow gate, right, between that, the align problems and resolutions, and you move into approve. Be nice if you knew the quality of that content before people go through that approval process. That helps streamline, helps become more efficient in your content supply chain, getting that content out to the LLM. All right, so that is quality checking before fine-tuning. Our next example is checking generated content, right? So in this scenario, our customer created a form-based experience at the front end of this process, where that form was really a list of questions that they were asking a large number of people in the organization, right? They plan to scale up to a few thousand people that have the ability to create this form. The ultimate goal is to generate an article or generate a document. So at the front end, the form is simple set of questions, right? Those questions are prompts when you string them together, right? And they form the structure of the document that you're looking for the LLM to produce. So at scale, you're working in context of a repository. There's a business workflow that is involved. Ultimately, that form gets completed by a user, goes under management, might go through some approval processes in order to align the content that has been added to the form. Are we using the right terminology? Are we consistent? Are we clear? Right? All of those qualities can be measured in context of that workflow. Then you know that the quality of that form, which is again those prompts, are being fed into the LLM in a controlled, organized way. What comes out is a generated article. You take that generated article and you walk that through the same kind of guardrail check, automated check of that article. Again, in the world that we're living in, this technology is moving so quickly. It still is a best practice to have a human being involved in checking that content. So that approval process there is still a people process. But that people process is informed by the content analytics, being able to measure the content and the alignment of that content to your standards, right? So again, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, right?
I love this example, Sean. And you're much smarter than I, but the whole idea of what is a prompt? A prompt is you're asking a question of something, and I immediately go back to when Google introduced Google, and they just had a box in the screen, and you put a question in there. Well, that's a prompt, and the idea that this company is now combining a bunch of boxes to say, what do you want to create? I want to create a blog article, and what's it about? It's about whatever widgets, and then the LLM produces that. It's kind of that almost that web question and answer model that we've all been trained to do as human beings, and now that generates articles. Is that cool? And then, but you're right, you gotta check that to make sure that output is appropriate, and then having a human being in the middle of that say, what was the score of that? Oh, that's a 72. We're not letting that go. Oh, that's 89. That's pretty good. Maybe I've been trained too much by my searches on the internet, but I love this model.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be article centric, right? The two examples we've got here so far have been kind of support and article centric. It can be any document that is structured and organized a bit, right? So release notes, right? So a form could be submit the form, goes into Jira, collects all of the bug fix issues and the related detail and brings it back, right? And starts to structure a release note document that is generated, right? It can be a policy and procedure. It can be, it really becomes the art of the possible in terms of what your organization needs to produce and for whom. And again, is it quality? Is the content going to do its job well for the organization? That's the reason for the guardrails that you put in place. And the content is at the center of this, not necessarily this new technology that is generative AI.
That's a huge call out. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So that's our second example here. We've got one more. And that is in context of a workflow. We're going to take a slightly different approach here. So if you're in the middle of a workflow where we're dealing with, it might be business users or professional writers, professional editors, crafting an email, what have you. In context of that writing experience, being able to leverage generative AI at the same time as being able to measure the quality of that content and how it aligns to your standards, right? So for our customers are on the line, you'll recognize on the right-hand side this is the Acrolinx sidebar that is the plug-in to the authoring tool, in this place Word. So run an Acrolinx check, it's identifying that there is a paragraph in here that is complex, it's unclear, it's got a number of characteristics that do not align to the standards. At a click of a button, right, we can reach out to the LLM, provide it with the problematic paragraph, as well as we're grounding it with RAG, right? The authoritative external source becomes your style guide that is the target inside of Acrolinx, right? So that is the RAG piece of it. You take the problematic content, you take your style guide, you send that as the engineered prompt into the LLM, and what comes back, again, in a matter of a second, maybe less, is the green text below that it is a suggestion for the writer on how to fix that. Now, if you take that simple scenario and say, okay, as a writer, it might take me manually, I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes to think creatively of how to make this paragraph more clear. I'm now distilling that down to, even if it's as much as a minute, right? That's a huge efficiency gain that you get in your workflow process. And if you tie that back to the need to generate 5 to 20 times more content, right, in the coming years, right, that is a huge ROI that is sitting there available to you. So that's just another example of how quality checking and context of workflows, when you incorporate this early in your workflow processes, right, early and often at the very beginning, you get an efficiency gain that is a ripple effect throughout that workflow. Reviews and approvals become that much faster. Publishing can become that much faster, right? If you leverage the scoring, right, you can start to shift your workflow processes. You can start to change your SLAs that you might have with partner organizations like legal, if they have to be reviewing content. I just threw a lot on the table here, so I'm gonna park it there. But the next slide will highlight this idea of grounding with RAG a little bit more, right? So I'll just repeat that in that user experience in Word, when you're in the Acrolinx sidebar and you click that button to get a suggestion, we're taking that content at step 1 and we're shifting to step 2, where we reach out to the style guide, we collect that information, and we add it to the prompt that goes into the LLM. What gets produced out is a completion that is grounded using RAG. And then it shifts to that next step, that's step 5, which is Acrolinx is again analyzing that completion against your style guide. Where we can make corrections or auto align the completion, we do, and then it's brought back to that user, right? So that is all happening from the user's perspective. It's a one click to get the suggestion, right? And again, that's that efficiency gain that we're bringing to the table, and leveraging grounding with RAG as that concept in order to drive the value of the generated content. I'm going to take a breath.
So this is how when humans are in the loop and need to be in the loop, how we make that much more efficient, right? And to not just follow a pattern, but to really reference an authoritative source, you know, your configured style guide, right, for these suggestions. So
yeah,
I get
but
that right.
these are ways that you can leverage to operationalize the use of generative AI.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep. Risk management is the words that keep coming to mind here.
Yeah.
If AI scares you, risk manage.
Right, right. Absolutely. Okay, so Sean, that I think you took us through these different examples.
I did. So, well, at a high level, it's care about the quality of the content that is ingested into your LLMs, right? Be mindful of the content that is coming out. One best practice is that LLMs can drift, right? So the idea of checking generated content, right? We've got a company that is a customer that is taking a topic per week. They're asking the LLM to produce a large amount of content on that topic. Then they're running it through an Acrolinx check to make sure that it's still aligned. If you see any drift taking place, they might go through a fine-tuning process again, right? Or they might revisit the RAG models that they're using. So that's just another application of these same concepts.
So if it drifts, it needs to bump up against a guardrail to stay on the road.
Well said. Yep.
Got it. All right. Great. Thank you, Sean. Again, those are just some specific examples or a selection of examples of what we're seeing. There are many different ways to implement guardrails, whether it's before fine-tuning on generated outputs, if you need a human in the loop along the workflow, how do we infuse capability to make those humans much more efficient, and all of that happening in a world where demand is about to continue to explode 5 to 20 times, and we need to think about some new ways, right, to really use automation and build a true content supply chain. So with that, we mentioned a bunch of terms. We tried to explain them in as simply as we can. We have published an AI glossary, which you will have received leading up to the event. I think Haley is going to put it in the chat as well, but it's available as a blog, just an easy reference to go back and when you hear certain terms that you're trying to make sure you're clear on, just to have a simple place to go back and really be able to understand those simply. So with that, Haley, let me ask, do we have any questions coming through?
Absolutely, and I just dropped that cheat sheet in the chat for everyone as well. Some good questions coming through and some commentary from Mike and Tosca, who is in the house. So thank you so much for that, Mike. First question, so what exactly is meant by content demand? In the first statistic mentioned about demand doubling. Is this specifically written word, advertising video scripts, user documentation, and who is surveyed? So basically, they'd appreciate more clarity about who customer prospects, other companies are asking for what types of content.
I think the answer is yes to
Exactly.
the first 2/3 of that. It's coming from everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not just written, it's everywhere. And so that was very inclusive. It'd be great if we could parse it all down to what is content and what types are being produced. The demand is there, but it is everything. It is written, it is video, it is audio, and every type of written, whether that's, to your point, Sean, you said tech docs, could be web content, could be marketing content, and a heck of a lot more than that.
Yeah. So from a governance perspective or guardrail perspective, right, you've got many business functions within the organization, right, that want different types of content for different purposes in a customer journey, right? If we generalize the customer journey as persuasive content, support content on the other end, right, that whole journey beginning to end. Different business functions have a need to produce content. You're going to be pulling from one or more LLM. You might end up with specialized LLMs. I think we're going to start to see that develop more and more. So that could help answer the question. But the concepts of guardrails that we've talked about here are universal, right? It's and the other piece of it, and I'll plug Acrolinx a bit. One of the things that is really exciting is you can have multiple style guides represented within the platform to use for that governance, right? So depending on the business function and what your needs are, the same LLM can be asked to produce different content that is aligned to those different style guides, right? So the idea of measuring becomes specific to the business case and the type of content and the audience that you're producing it for.
That's huge, because I think sometimes when we talk about content, we can genericize the term, but legal content versus technical docs content versus marketing content. I love it. Persuasive content. How's that for a term? All of those might be scored differently based on the output of the LLM, based on that specific style guide for that business use case or department, if you will.
Yep, but you want to use the same terminology that is appropriate for the subject matter, whether you're talking to an investor or you're on a social media post, right? There's some language that is just critical to be consistent on across all of those channels, all of those content formats, all of those document types. Yep.
Awesome. Next question. So the bar graph about testing and implementing. So I believe it's in reference to slide 9 for our panelists. Open versus closed AI systems was a little unclear. It looked as if most companies were listed as closed on the bottom of the table for the large implementations, with only a few smaller groups labeled open. So I was confused that the conclusion was that most groups were using open source. Was the graph meant to, what was the graph meant to demonstrate? Might be testing versus in production.
Yeah, so let me take that. So again, we can share the slides for people to go through. What came through in that report is that there's a significant amount of testing taking place across a wide range of models, including open source, and that, but the OpenAI is today dominating in terms of what's actually in production. And when there's a lot of testing going on different models, including open source, it suggests that those are likely to move into production going forward. And again, that portion of testing that's going on in open source is quite significant. We really see a variety of things out there in our actual conversations. We see, we see organizations that have open source that they're fine tuning. We're seeing different types of domain-specific LLMs. We're seeing a lot of private instances of Microsoft Azure OpenAI deployments. It's a wide range. And I think the point is that when we look forward, enterprises are going to have different models, and they're going to change over time. And the right one is going to depend on the use case. And in that type of varied landscape, again, when everything is increasing, if standards are important, there needs to be a way to make sure that that you can have guardrails in that varied landscape. Kurt, John, anything to add to that?
No, I think that was great. Absolutely.
All right. A quick one is the IBM paper public.
Yeah.
Yep. So we can get that to everybody too. All right, here's another one. How is Acrolinx different or complementary to applications being built on public or private LLMs?
I'll go.
Sounds like a John question. Go for
it. Different or the same? The same principles that we've been talking about here about guardrails of knowing the content going in and knowing the content coming out, right, is again universal. Building applications, some of the applications we're seeing built is one is the idea of a moderator that sits between the company and the company's clients, right? So as the clients start asking questions about products, they're trying to get answers. They're not always using the best language to ask the question, right? So take that prompt, normalize that prompt, optimize it, the question, to feed into the LLM to generate the best answer, right? So again, what comes back as a completion can run through that moderator, align the completion, and then bring it back to the client, right? We're seeing customers building those types of applications. The whole webinar that we've talked about here and the values that Acrolinx brings would apply in that same scenario. It's an unflattering adage here, and I'm certainly not calling your content bad content, but garbage in, garbage out, right? The old database adage, right? So you got to be mindful about what is going in, what's going out, and how do you apply that model to, in this case, this client asking a question, right? Maybe not doing it well, the produced result, the completion coming back, you want to check that as well. So you've got that check and balance on either side of it. That is another just kind of context of these same best practices being applied.
Yeah, I think the interesting comment there was building applications, and the landscape is sort of evolving out there, and I think I'm going to say what we've said all along. Coming back to the guardrails, it's interesting. There are no-code platforms out there that have private LLMs that sort of make building a business application really easy, right? Or is there intense risk potentially in that as well, where it's a private LLM that's trained on a smaller set of data, and oh, by the way, it's powering our corporate whatever tool that we built on a specific platform. You darn well better be having some guardrails on that, or you could, in essence, introduce unknown business risk. So that's how I would answer that, because I like to build applications, but I also want to make sure that those applications, what's going into them, what's powering them, is correct data. And I'm old enough, Sean, also to remember the term garbage in, garbage out. And in an LLM, you want the widest possible set of data going into your LLM as well. And if you have a private LLM that's smaller data set or isn't vetted in the real world, I will always go back to guardrails. You have to.
Yep.
So Haley, ending on the importance of guardrails.
Right? We've got a 30 seconds here, Haley.
Yep. Hey, that's a good place to stop for sure. All right. Well, thank you all so much to our audience members, to our incredible presenters. This was really great. And again, we'll have all of this on the website by the weekend. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you all have a stellar day.
Excellent. Thank you.